All right. Yeah, I'm glad to be able to make a presentation this morning for the webinar series. That's some work that a number of us did over the last year or so, and this was actually presented recently at the National Wild Turkey Symposium, and I'll get to that. But we're going to talk about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on spring 2020 turkey hunting across the United States. So first of all, I want to acknowledged co-authors and collaborators, and explain a little bit about how we got there. But in alphabetical order, they were Adam Butler with Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, myself, Zach Danks, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, Alicia Davis, also with the commission. Alicia was our Qualtrics guru. Kent Frick with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, and Michael Chavone with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So back about 4 years or so now, and Chris Cray's on the webinar. So Chris, if there's anything you want to jump in with, certainly feel free to. But back in the original planning phases of the National Wild Turkey Symposium, which our agency and the National Wild Turkey Federation just recently hosted. There was some discussion, and basically Chris Cray and Chris Moorman, who's the editor of the symposium proceedings, and I were in a conversation, and basically the invitation was extended to pull together a group of folks to look at the possible implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on turkey hunting. At that time, it was still in 2020. It was in the last half of 2020. There had been quite a bit of speculation about the potential impacts of the pandemic on turkey hunting and, of course, other activities. But we decided to pull together a group of folks, and based on some recommendations from Chris and others, we went to each one of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency regions and looked at the National Wild Turkey Technical Committee and pulled and requested participation from members off that technical committee, one each to those regions. So it gave us some good representation from across the country. As I said, this uh, work was presented recently at the National Wild Turkey Symposium in Asheville, and it has been published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin. It's a special section, the National Wild Turkey Symposium. This is the 12th proceedings, very first time it's ever been published as part of the Wildlife Society Bulletin. So that was a great achievement by the editors, both for the bulletin and for the symposium. But if you're a Wildlife Society member, of course, you can access that very easily through your membership. Otherwise, you can get to that a couple different ways online, but it is available in this new format. So starting back in 2020, of course, a lot of this is old history for many folks, but back in January, China confirmed that they had COVID-19 infections. And also in January, the CDC declared that there was a public health emergency. And then in March and April, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, and governments, including the US government, began putting out advisories. And of course, as y'all remember, all kinds of state issued restrictions and our recommendations came out. And we certainly had our share of those here in North Carolina. So some of the questions that people began to ask is, when you combine the COVID-19 pandemic and a spring turkey season, which, as you'll see in most places, started either before or very soon after the pandemic was declared. If you combine those two things together, what are we going to end up with? Of course, spring turkey hunting is a biological and a social balancing act. We have lots of considerations from the biological side, everything from reproduction to population trends. And then, of course, social issues, especially related to turkey hunting. And Typically, turkey hunters wanting to see a season open earlier or some kind of different bag limits or those kind of things. There's also been turkey population declines in a number of places, including a significant part of the Southeast. And so the pandemic response would have, it was predicted, thoughts were, you're going to have more people with more time, but is the kill really going to go up? Are license sales going to go up? Lots of questions out there at the time. So really, to summarize what everybody was asking at that time, it was really a question of, will a time windfall result in a turkey population downfall? And nobody really knew the answer to that. So, again, would there be more hunter participation? Most people thought there would be. Would there be more effort? Maybe. Would the kill, the reported harvest go up? Most people thought so in most places. But then the real question is, would turkey populations remain sustainable? Again, there's a lot of concern about population status in a lot of different places. And some of the sustainability questions related to demand from residents and non-residents alike, which, as you'll see, varies a lot across the country. Decline in turkey reproductive success, which we heard a lot about at the symposium. Several of you on here were there and heard papers as well. There was, and actually in this regard continues to be, a dearth of data relative to these kinds of social dynamics. And there's always debate about regulations. There's debate about turkey hunting regulations when there's not a pandemic. There was when there is a pandemic. So there's always debate about regulations. So our real goals were to establish reference points of information before and during the pandemic's onset in 2020 for spring turkey hunting effort, and reported kill. We knew from the beginning that one human dimension study, even pulling biological data through that study, would not allow anyone to completely evaluate the impacts, if there were any, of the pandemic on turkey hunting. But we wanted to find out what transpired, how it varied across the country, and develop a baseline, if you will, for future evaluations and to inform future decisions about turkey management. So, how did we do this? As I said earlier, it was a Qualtrics human dimension survey. It was a web-based survey of all the agency turkey biologists, project leaders, big game, upland game bird biologists, whatever they're called in an individual state. In essence, it included the members of the National Wild Turkey Technical Committee. And we also included several Canadian provinces that have turkeys as well. Basically, any political jurisdiction in North America that had, other than Mexico, that had turkeys, we surveyed. We opened the survey on the 19th of March and closed it on the 7th of May. That was a pretty long time to run the survey, but we did that to try to get our response rate as high as possible. We also did that to try to give some states more of an opportunity to get some data for some of the questions that we knew we would have. You'll see that, in our case, for example, in North Carolina, that was still a little quick to have all the data for all the different questions that we asked. We ask 11 different questions. We sort of group those in 4 different categories. Of course, we just ask respondent information, try to get into the state-specific pandemic conditions. And we started out asking a whole bunch of different variabilities of those conditions. But as you'll see, we ended up just sort of lumping those into a couple of categories. Of course, turkey population status and hunting dynamics, in most cases, those variables were compared for 2020 to the 3 previous years. And then we used R for the data analysis and visualizations. Um, uh, I mentioned the co-authors earlier. Zach from Kentucky was the senior author on the actual published paper, and he was our R guru. So this was really a qualitative project. We debated long and hard about trying to run a bunch of stats on the results of this survey, but in the end, because it was one survey over 1 year, we decided that that would be inappropriate. So the results that you'll see in that are in the paper are qualitative results. We did tabulate those by state, and we also used Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies region. And there's some reasons for doing that that I'll get to geographically in terms of our ability to compare. As I said, we didn't seek to actually identify the effects of hunting on turkey populations after one season because that's just not possible. Sometimes we can't even do it after a couple. But it was a foundation, or is a foundation, for future monitoring. And who knows, the way things are going, we may be using this for some additional evaluations sooner instead of later. Response rate was pretty high. Of course, you would expect a high response rate with this kind of survey and with this group. It certainly was a topic of interest for all of the participants. But we had a 90% response rate. That was 47 states. We did not get any responses from Canada. So I combined a number of things here. One is I want to point out, if you're not familiar with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency regions, those are highlighted in the heavy black lines. You have a Western region, a Midwest region, a Southeast region, and a Northeast region. And as I start through some of the figures, you'll see them grouped by region. We did that because we wanted to have some way to try to look at geographic variability. But because turkeys are a state trust resource and regulations and management approaches vary so much from one state to the other, we decided that these large AFWA geographic regions would be one of the best approaches. We did ask all of the folks in the survey to indicate, based on the best available information, whether their turkey populations from 2015 to 2020 were increasing, staying the same, or decreased. And so you'll see, as a very general statement, the states in the West are either increasing or staying the same. A lot of variability in the central part of the country and the Northeast relative to status. But most states are either staying the same or decreasing, especially in the East, except for North Carolina. But if you look at the Southeast, you'll notice a lot of what many people are hearing turkey biologists in all those states talk about, and that is population declines. We also asked the respondents about their regulations, whether or not regulations were had been consistent over the last 5 years, and the quality of their data. In other words, whether the respondents felt like their data have been of consistent quality. And we asked that honestly to try to get a better handle on whether or not these 3, 4, 5 year comparisons really held much weight. But we found that about 90% of the states said that their regulations had been consistent, or for the most part consistent, with very minor changes, and that their data quality was good and had been consistent over those years. So that made us feel pretty good about the analyses that we conducted. So one of the things that we looked at was how turkey season opening dates related to the onset of the pandemic. This is a good indication of the variability of turkey season opening dates by region and by state. So again, on the region axis, southeast, west, midwest, northeast, all of these are going to be these AFWA regions, and then dates on the x-axis. And interestingly, and you'll hear me say this several times, there's a lot of variability. One of the things that really struck me after we did this study was the amount of variability in all of these data sets among states. But you'll see Mississippi on the left opened in mid-March, all the way to mid-May for Washington State, and everywhere in between. North Carolina, of course, is right there on the southeast row in the middle, opens up the first part of April. Youth season opens the first Saturday in April. Regular season opens the second Saturday in April. So lots of variability across the country. So in asking all of the respondents to describe the pandemic status of their state during the 2020 turkey season, as I said earlier, we gave them multiple options and we listed those. There's 6, and told them to check all that applied. And you might imagine that when we got responses to the survey, we had a lot of information to try to congest. So what we did was we grouped it all into 2 categories. Basically, we said either the restriction was none or it was only COVID related, some sort of restriction that had nothing to do with hunting, or it was specifically turkey hunting and or access related. North Carolina was in the none or COVID only category. That's why the 33 is highlighted as yellow. And 70% of the respondents said that their status during the 2020 turkey season was either none or COVID only restrictions, and 30% had turkey hunting or access restrictions. And these could include, for example, a couple states significantly or completely, in some cases, eliminated options for non-resident hunters. Some places closed areas for hunting in some states. That obviously was a smaller percentage, but that did happen. So we also looked at the time between turkey season opening and the beginning of COVID-19 restrictions. Again, this is grouped by AFWA region, and a negative number, for example, the negative 38 in the Western region, means that the season started before the restrictions. And so, for the most part, most of the states, the season started after restrictions were in place, but that was pretty variable again across the country. Here in North Carolina, our restrictions started in March, and our youth season, as I said earlier, opened in the first Saturday, April, and in 2020, that was April the 4th. So we would be in the Southeast, we would be one of the positive numbers. Of course, everybody wondered about hunter participation and what the pandemic was going to do to hunter participation. That was part of the concern about potential increased kill. So we looked at residents and non-residents separately. We did that primarily because some states separate them. We don't, but some states separate residents and non-residents. And in some states like Kansas, for example, the non-resident hunters are a significant part of their hunter population during turkey season. Anyway, the choices we asked were whether more people turkey hunted, whether less people turkey hunted, whether individual turkey hunters hunted more, whether those individual turkey hunters hunted less, or none of the above. And so we lump them as listed here for residents. 48% of the respondents indicated that more people hunted and individual hunters hunted more, and 39% indicated that just more people hunted. And then for non-residents, 56% indicated that there were less non-residents turkey hunting. So that certainly as in many of the states was a pretty significant impact. In North Carolina, Chris responded that more people turkey hunted and individual turkey hunters hunted more. And so you'll see that pop up again on some data graphs. And so some of these variables that I discussed are interesting to compare, not only among regions, but also the type of COVID restrictions. So in these figures, the way we laid these out is, in this case, of course, for licenses, and this is a comparison between 2020, the pandemic year, and the 3 previous years. So in these graphs, what we did was we grouped them by AFWA regions. So West, Midwest, Southeast, Northeast. And then the closed circles had turkey hunting or access restrictions only, and the open circles had no restrictions or COVID only restrictions. And again, as you can see, there's a lot of variability, but in general, in most states, license sales increased in 2020 compared to 2017 and 2019. Now, we did ask this question very specific to licenses that were specific for turkey hunting. So, for example, in North Carolina, and the reason I say data unavailable for North Carolina is the way our license system works. Of course, turkey hunters are not required to have a specific turkey stamp or a turkey tag. We get authorization numbers, but you can turkey hunt with a whole slew of different licenses in North Carolina. So there are states in each one of these who could not reply because they did not have data available in their state. Changing the number of hunters again, 2020 versus previous 3 years. I won't go back through all the layout for the graphs or for the figures unless people need them. In general, you could argue that the Southeast is an exception, but in general, the number of hunters went up. But it's interesting to me that in the Southeast, which is the third column from the left, you have more states with a decrease in the number of hunters than an increase. Again, we didn't have those data available for North Carolina because we don't separate them out that way. Effort is always really important, and effort is always something that's difficult to get a handle on. We are able to do it the way our wildlife management division does surveys, but it is a hard variable to quantify. But for the states that had effort data, we again did a comparison between 2020 and the 3 previous years, and in this case, we defined effort as the total hunter days. Again, for the most part, it increased. So in most states, license sales increased, number of hunters increased, effort increased. Effort, if you look at it as days per hunter, increased. Again, a lot of variability, but note in the Southeast, even though we don't have data available for North Carolina in the Southeast, almost all the states, all but Florida, showed an increase. And then, of course, what everybody was most concerned about was change in harvest, the turkey kill. Reported kill, 2020 versus the 3 previous years, everybody well, not everybody. There were a lot of people that were questioning whether or not reported harvest would go up because the thought was if it did, it could potentially have a negative impact on turkey populations, especially in places that are already experiencing some issues. We had lots of information on this. You can see a huge spread. I mentioned Kansas earlier, second column from the left. One of the reasons Kansas went down so far is because of the whole non-resident hunter issue. And they had turkey hunting and access restrictions. And so they indicated that that's one of the reasons that their reported harvest went down over 40%, which is pretty big. Noted in the southeast, including North Carolina, a lot of variability, a lot of up, a lot of down. In North Carolina, our reported harvest during 2020 was up 28% from the average of the 3 previous years. So, again, trying to generalize, which is hard to do with a state trust resource. In most places, harvest went up. And I just mentioned this, but this is a graph of the reported kill in North Carolina. And because of the way we did the comparisons, I just started with 2017. So if you look at 2020 compared to 3 previous years, of course, there was a jump up, 28%, I believe it was. But then notice that for the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, the reported kill has gone down. What that'll do in the future, who knows? What's causing that? There's a lot of discussion that we could have about that. And, Hannah's on here, Chris is on here, others are on here. But the reality of it is, after the peak in the pandemic year, it has gone down the last 2 years. I make no assumptions about what that means. It just is. So the other thing that we decided to look at was what we've called take per unit effort. And I noticed there's a couple of fisheries folks on here. So, the fisheries folks tend to use take per unit effort a lot more than the wildlife folks do. And there's pros and cons to this variable, but we really wanted to try to get to a variable that would allow us to look at this harvest per day, this harvest per hunter day. So we had the season reported kill, we had the season reported effort for some states. But what we wanted to be able to do is we said, well, if there is a situation where more people are hunting and turkey hunters are hunting more, in other words, we got new people out there and we've got old people, or not old like me, but previous turkey hunters out there who are just hunting more. Are they actually killing more per day? Or are they just spending more time in the woods? And so we were able to tease that out by using harvest per hunter day for a handful of states. We could not calculate it for North Carolina, but you'll see, unlike almost all the other variables, reported harvest per hunter day in the states that had those data actually went down, except in the state of Florida, which to us was extremely interesting. You balance the harvest per hunter day with the overall increase in reported kill, the increase in the number of licenses sold, and it made us wonder if this is a reflection of there being more novice turkey hunters out there. For those of you who turkey hunt, like all hunting, you don't just walk out there and start without at least some mentoring or some experience. And so we really wonder if this is a reflection of having the increased number of people in the woods, but them being less successful individually on an individual day. So if you take all of those things and you combine them together, here's what you have. Here's sort of the punchline. Reported harvest, license sales, number of hunters, total hunter days, total days per hunter for most states, all increased. As a general statement, those variables increased during 2020 compared to the 3 previous years. The one variable that didn't was take per unit effort. What does that all mean for turkey populations? We don't know the answer to that, and I don't suppose the answer to that, but it's very interesting to see what happens over the next few years, I think. So to wrap it up, I do want to, although I mentioned the co-authors, I do want to recognize all the different agencies, because we all of us that worked on this project have full-time jobs, and so we just all sort of agreed to take this on as part of our current responsibilities. Lots and lots of it was paid through wildlife restoration. And of course, the agencies include not only the Wildlife Commission, but Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Mississippi Wildlife Fisheries and Parks, and Kansas Wildlife and Parks. And with that, I'm going to stop. And I will take any comments or questions anybody has. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So I don't really know what y'all are seeing, but I tried to stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions or comments, you can either try to type them in the chat, or you can just jump right in and ask them.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
This is Chris Craig.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Go ahead, Chris.
So how do you interpret the, and I guess maybe I'd also like to hear from some of our fisheries folks that are on here. What's your take on the sort of across the board, there was, lower take per day, catch per unit effort type assessment? Do you think that means collectively across most of those states that the amount of hunting pressure is basically on top of the turkey population? They're taking all the surplus birds. So when you have more effort and more hunting, you don't actually have more birds there to take. Do you interpret it that way at all, or is it simply that there's new hunters out there that are not as effective? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it could be either. I don't think, although, when I look at the graph for us, that Ryan sent me, it's, as it's an exponential curve basically, but I have a hard time thinking that there's enough turkey hunters in the woods to be killing every killable turkey. I wonder, I mean, maybe it is. That certainly is a possibility. I wonder if it's not more novice hunters out there. I also wonder if there's not a certain element that year of thought that, well, I'll use us as an example. Somebody could have said, well, I've got a month-long season. I'm under a stay-at-home order. I could potentially hunt 3 times or whatever times more than I have in the past. So, I may not want to try to kill a bird or two first thing in the season. I may want to try to spread that out. I don't know that it's that. I mean, it's hard to say. At least for me, it is.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. It's always interesting to ponder those numbers a little bit, try to figure out what they mean.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And as turkey hunting success is so variable. Just speaking personally, for me, daily success from one year to the next varies a lot. So, and that could just be me. I could just be a crappy turkey hunter, but it varies a lot. I think there was somebody else too that had a question. I'm not sure.
Hey, David, it's TR. Can you hear me?
Yeah, man, I hear you.
I'm wondering what you think about more hunters in the woods. Just because they don't take a bird, do they still lead to quote unquote take or pursuing of birds? Do they impact the resource? In the cases I came in contact with 2 hunters, They were running through the woods, calling their heads off, running turkeys around, whatnot, could lead to less breeding or, just moving gobblers out of their preferred habitat or hens. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt the more people you have in the woods, the less birds, in my opinion, the more people you have in the woods, the less birds are going to gobble, and they're not as what I call killable. I do think they're sensitive to disturbance. I mean, I know they are in terms of some other variables, but I think disturbance during the hunting season is really important. And I always think there's more birds out there than people think they are. I tell a friend of mine who's a landowner, I said, well, if you think there's 10, there's 20. There's probably twice as many as he thinks are out there. And there's no doubt in my mind that when you're out there turkey hunting, there's birds that you're not hearing gobble that's hearing you. And I think you're right. I think people have a big impact on that. Somebody has their hand. Oh, Cindy Simpson.
Yeah, hey David.
Hey,
Kind of like what we've seen around the suburban neighborhoods with the way white-tailed deer migrate to the easy pickings for food, and therefore there's less huntable deer because they're in those no gun zones kind of thing. Do you think any of that could be happening with turkeys? I'm basing that off of the number of people I know in neighborhoods that have trail cameras in their backyard because they have wooded areas around, and they're seeing all kinds of gobbler occupation, and so I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not some of the success around those areas could be related to birds are in unhuntable locations.
yeah, I mean, it could be. What's causing them to go there? I think there could be several options, maybe food, but also I think disturbance. But, it's just like we had this symposium in Asheville, and there's a bunch of turkeys. People see turkeys in the middle of Asheville all the time. And Chris, I'm gonna tell you a story. You can jump in if you want to. Was standing at in the top level of the hotel and looked out in the parking lot, and there was a turkey hen walking around in the parking lot in the middle of Asheville. So, yeah, I'm not convinced it's necessarily all food related, but I definitely think birds can be moved around quite a bit during the spring. I'm looking at the list. Chris Cray, I'm gonna go back to your comment, and I may try to. I'm not gonna put any of them on point by name, but I know there are some fish folks on here. I don't know. You had asked about their thoughts on the take per unit effort. I don't know if any of the fish folks want to weigh in on that or not. And I'm gonna take the silence as not.
David, this is Doug Vesler. I can take a shot at that, I suppose.
Hey, Doug, thanks.
Yeah, Chris, to answer your question, I mean, we definitely saw a bump on the fishery side in 2020, and I'm sure a lot of that was either lapsed anglers who were deciding to fish again because they had time on their hands, or folks who were looking for something to do and were trying it again. So I'm sure that probably had something to do with it, no doubt. And I guess I got a question. Would y'all think about teasing out, just you could look at a bit at hunting license sales, couldn't you, David? Because if you had that bump in sales in the spring, even though we couldn't ID folks by turkey only, right? Because there's no longer a turkey tag, just the fact that when those licenses were purchased relative to the turkey season, you could also determine whether they were new hunters, or I guess it depends on the license type. If they bought just a hunting only license, you could assume that maybe that bump would have been solely or largely because of turkey hunting. Does that make sense? Because obviously, you wouldn't expect someone to buy a hunting license during the middle of the turkey season. for deer hunting in the fall, you know, that they would have turkey on their mind at that point.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we could have done that. The group of us discussed at length how to try to deal with licenses. And one of the reasons we didn't do those kind of evaluations is because the licenses that allow the turkey hunting privilege not only vary so much within North Carolina, but also in every state. You know, so arguably a large percentage of the people who turkey hunt here have lifetime license, for example. And so there would be
Yeah.
no way to tease that out.
Right.
All right. Anybody have any more questions or comments? Not seeing any, so I will simply say thanks again for being here. I appreciate you tuning in as always. We should have another one next month. Next month, hopefully we'll get back to the second Tuesday in the month, but we'll get this thing posted, and I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.